As a reporter for a small-town newspaper in the Midwest, I had been pulling late nights all week. My boss, noticing my fatigue, granted me some time off for Friday afternoon. After completing a few errands, I headed home, hoping to catch a quick nap in my trusty recliner. But as I pulled into the driveway, an unsettling sight made my stomach drop. 2 cars. One was my wife, Irene's, which I expected, but the other was unfamiliar. It was unusual for Irene to be home in the afternoon since she worked as an actuary for a mid-sized insurance company, adhering to a strict 8-2-5 schedule. Still, I didn't jump to wild conclusions. After 7 years of marriage, I believed we had a strong bond and trusted her completely. With that faith, I unlocked the front door, unaware that my world was about to shatter. The moment I stepped inside, unmistakable sounds greeted me, moans and the rhythmic thumping of 2 bodies in passion, clearly coming from our bedroom upstairs. The door must have been wide open. They clearly hadn't expected anyone to walk in on them. As I hurried up the stairs, the sounds became even clearer. "Is this what your husband isn't giving you?" I heard a deep, unfamiliar voice sneer, and Irene's moans echoed back, revealing her enjoyment. By the time I reached the doorway, the scene was undeniable. My wife, my beautiful wife, was on her back under some guy who looked like he could bench press a truck, giving her everything I thought I had provided all these years. Despite what he was saying, Irene had never hinted at any dissatisfaction in our marriage. But watching this unfold, it was evident that I had fallen short in her eyes. A wave of nausea hit me as the reality of the moment settled in. My entire life was unraveling before me. Without thinking, I walked to the closet, grabbed my gym bag, and started shoving clothes inside. The guy, Hugo, as I would later learn, barely slowed down. Irene finally noticed my presence and scrambled to cover herself. "Oh, Derek, I'm so sorry. You weren't supposed to find out this way," she cried, still entangled with him. "When was I supposed to find out, Irene? On our 10th anniversary?" I shot back, stuffing more clothes into the bag. "From the looks of it, this isn't your first rodeo with him. Couldn't you at least have the decency to give me a heads up?" Hugo finally stopped thrusting but didn't bother to pull out. Irene tried to peer around his massive frame, still not grasping the gravity of the situation. "Whatever," I said. "I'll be out of your way in a minute. I'll come by later to get the rest of my things, and I'll have my lawyer send over the divorce papers. By the way, who's this clown?" Irene let out a half-nervous laugh. "This is Hugo. He's my attorney. He works for a big firm downtown." "Perfect," I muttered, zipping up the gym bag. Without another word, I walked out, not even bothering to close the door behind me. I tossed my things into my truck and drove straight to the Ironwood pub, my usual bar. Not exactly how I had envisioned kicking off the weekend. The bar was nearly empty, typical for a Friday afternoon. My favorite bartender, Zane, wouldn't be in until 4 o'clock, so I sat there, lost in thought. In hindsight, I probably should have seen this coming. At the last work event I attended with Irene, her co-workers made their disdain for me pretty obvious. By the end of the night, I felt she was beginning to share their views about my job and my financial situation. Irene never missed a chance to remind me that she earned twice what I did. On the drive home that night, I confronted her about her behavior. She brushed it off, blaming it on alcohol, and we moved on, or so I thought. Apparently, things hadn't been okay for quite some time. Here I was, sitting at the bar, feeling indifferent about everything. I knew I should be dealing with practical matters, like transferring half our joint money into an account in my name, but I lacked the energy. All I wanted was to drown my sorrows in whiskey and forget everything for a while. With my credit card in hand, I decided to get plastered and crash in my truck later. A hotel or apartment didn't matter. I just wanted to escape. Irene and I had met during our years at a major Midwestern university, dating through our junior and senior years. By the time I proposed, we both understood that unless I landed a job at a major newspaper, she would always be the primary breadwinner. But we had an understanding. Everything we made was ours together. At least, that's what I believed until recently. Somewhere along the way, Irene's respect for me faded, perhaps influenced by her co-workers. As for her love, well, today had shown me just how far I had fallen in her eyes. When Zane finally clocked in at 4 o'clock, he was surprised to see me there so early. I quickly explained the situation and handed him my truck keys, telling him not to return them until I was done drinking and ready to crash. I didn't care where I ended up as long as I wasn't behind the wheel. "Man, that's rough," Zane said, shaking his head. "Finding out like that?" By 9 p.m., I was beyond feeling anything, physically or emotionally. That's when a state trooper walked into the bar. He approached Zane, exchanged a few words, then made his way toward me. My whiskey-soaked brain barely registered him, but I noticed how casually he moved, like he was an expert at taking his time. "Are you Derek White?" he asked. I nodded. "I've got some news." "I'm sorry to have to tell you." He paused, as if trying to find the right words. "Your wife, Irene, and a Mr. Hugo Reed were killed in an accident about 3 hours ago. A semi ran a red light and crushed their BMW convertible. Authorities have been looking for you. It took a while for someone to mention you might be here." His words took a moment to sink in. When they did, I didn't respond the way he expected. Instead, I threw up my arms and shouted, "Drinks on me! There really is a God in heaven." A cheer rose from the bar, and the trooper looked like he had just seen a ghost. Clearly, he hadn't anticipated that reaction from someone who had just lost their wife. "Mr. White, I understand this must be a shock." "Shock?" I laughed, slurring my words. "More like pure ecstasy, officer. I walked in on the two of them screwing in my own bed this afternoon. I was going to leave her. Hell, I couldn't have asked for a better outcome." Trooper Reginald Masters, as he later introduced himself, looked visibly uncomfortable. He exchanged a glance with Zane. "We typically ask the next of kin to identify the bodies, but I'm guessing Mr. White won't be up for that tonight. Could you make sure he gets the message to come to the morgue tomorrow?" Zane nodded, but even in my drunken state, I grasped the weight of what had just been said. Although I knew that once I sobered up, I might feel some loss for Irene, the anger from her betrayal was still more potent than any lingering affection. At that moment, I couldn't bring myself to care. The next morning, I woke up stiff and achy in the cab of my truck. I probably looked as rough as I felt, but I forced myself to head to the bar to retrieve my keys. Initially, I considered finding a hotel, but the memory of the trooper's words led me back to my empty house instead. As I walked through the door, nostalgia washed over me, reminding me of the 9 years we had shared, 7 of them as husband and wife. Instead of grieving, however, I felt a strange sense of relief. Even sober, I couldn't help but think that Irene and Hugo had gotten exactly what they deserved. I showered, got dressed, and made my way to the morgue. When I saw Irene's body, it was a mess, crushed and battered, the aftermath of a semi hitting a convertible. I asked to see Hugo's body as well. He looked just as broken. Somewhere deep down, I hoped his death had come slowly, though I had no way of knowing. Back home, I knew I had to start making the dreaded phone calls, first to my parents, then to Irene's, and finally to her sister, Julia. Despite everything, I felt a pang of sadness for Felix and Elise Jenkins, her parents. I had always cared for them deeply, almost as much as my own. Losing a daughter, no matter the circumstances, is never easy, and I dreaded being the one to deliver the news. But as for Irene, every thought of her was overshadowed by the memory of walking in on her with Hugo, urging him on. I refused to fake emotions I didn't feel, so I decided I'd report the facts, do what needed to be done, and keep my personal feelings out of it for Felix and Elise's sake. I'd get through it, but I couldn't muster any real sorrow for her. Not anymore. I called my parents first to break the news. My mom, always the emotional one, immediately burst into tears. I was convinced we were all on the brink of tears. "Take care," I whispered, my voice barely above a whisper as I turned to leave. All the moving, the calls, and clearing out happened within the first 2 weeks after Irene's death. In the midst of it all, I received a call from Riverside Insurance Group. I knew what it was about. Irene and I had always kept life insurance policies, discussing them countless times. Since it was her area of expertise, I had let her make the final decisions. One of those decisions was a $1 million life insurance policy on both of us, with a double indemnity clause for accidental death prior to age 45. That meant a $2 million payout was heading my way. In the chaos of everything else, I hadn't even considered it, but when I returned the call to the insurance agent, what they said nearly made me spit out my coffee. The agent explained that since the truck driver had caused the accident, his company would likely be liable for a wrongful death settlement. If I wanted to avoid a lengthy court battle, she advised that I should demand at least another $2 million, though she believed $3 million to $4 million was more realistic. After the lawyer's fees, I was looking at roughly $5 million in the bank. In the end, I settled for $4.75 million after the attorney took his cut. Not that it mattered much. I was numb to it all. The trucking company settled with Hugo Reed's widow as well, and we were both scheduled to sign the paperwork simultaneously. I hadn't met his widow before, and I was taken aback when I did. While Irene had always been beautiful, Hugo's widow was equally stunning, if not more. It left me wondering why he'd risked his marriage for an affair. Maybe he thought he'd never get caught. After the paperwork was signed, Tessa Reed invited me out for coffee. I wasn't sure what more there was to discuss, but I agreed. Once we sat down, she got straight to the point. My husband never mentioned knowing an Irene White. After checking, I found out she wasn't even a client of his firm. No one there seems to know who she was, or if they do, they're not telling me. What was your wife to my husband, Mr. White? I took a deep gulp of my coffee, feeling the weight of what I was about to say. Oh, that bad? She asked, her expression tight with expectation. I couldn't avoid the truth any longer, so I told her everything. From walking in on Irene and Hugo to how it all played out. Her face twisted with a mix of shock and revulsion, and I felt my stomach turn as I finished recounting the story. Thank you for being honest, she said quietly before standing up and walking out of the coffee shop without another word. Despite having more money than I'd ever dreamed of, my life felt utterly empty. I had no interest in dating, no passion for much of anything. I rented a dingy one-bedroom apartment just to have a place to sleep. My social circle had shrunk to almost nothing, and I didn't really care. I still worked at the paper, rode my bike when I felt like it, and lifted weights at the gym. Other than that, I just existed. My dad finally convinced me to see a therapist. The diagnosis? Trust issues. The therapist encouraged me to get out more, to try and rebuild some semblance of a life. It was a waste of time. I never went back after the first session. One night, as I sat in my apartment half watching a baseball game, I found myself replaying the conversation I'd had with Julia after Irene's funeral. She had called me a small man with small dreams, writing small stories for a small newspaper. And she was right. I had taken the job to be near Irene, always assuming I'd move on to something bigger when the time was right. But now, I wasn't tied to anything. I didn't even need to work anymore if I didn't want to. I was free to come and go as I pleased, to write whatever I wanted, with no regard for who might read it. The next day, I walked into the office and gave my boss, Todd, 2 weeks' notice. That night, I sat in my apartment staring at my modest collection of books. Out of the 30 or so I owned, only 2 were fiction. One of those was Moby Dick. It got me thinking, which is dangerous for someone like me. My mind works in abstract, constantly twisting ideas around and following random trains of thought. In the days before the internet made hyperlinking easy, I'd do it all in my head, much to the frustration of anyone trying to follow my conversations. 10 minutes later, the realization hit me. Irene was my white whale. I had to hunt her down, but I'd do it through writing. That's when it all started. I sat down at my computer and wrote my first piece of fiction since 8th grade. In that story, the Hugo character was killed off, and the Irene character faced the brutal consequences of her actions. It took me 2 days to write, edit, and polish it, and for the first time in 6 months, I felt alive. I couldn't exact my revenge on Irene in real life, but I could in my stories. Over the next 2 months, I wrote 17 more short stories. Each time the Hugo character met a grim end and the Irene character received her due punishment. There was something deeply satisfying about finishing each story, setting it aside, and then reading the result. It felt like a release. One day, I glanced at my copy of Moby Dick. It was a physical book with a cover and pages, something tangible. That's when I realized I could do that too, and so I did. 6 months later, I completed my first novel, a historical romance of all things. Naturally, The Hugo character met a vicious end, and the Irene character was humbled once again. I thought it was decent, and apparently a publisher agreed. The deal wasn't great, but at least I didn't have to pay to have it self-published. Somehow, despite everything, my first book really caught on. It seemed like people were connecting with the story, or maybe with the raw emotions I'd poured into it. The publisher did 2 more runs, and before I knew it, they were asking for a second book, offering me double the money. Why not, I thought. So I wrote another. This time, it was a murder mystery, but as you might guess, the Hugo character got killed again, and the Irene character ended up in jail again. Completing that second book felt good, like I was finally reclaiming some control over my life. The strong sales didn't hurt either. It was like a chorus of readers agreeing with me about how Irene and Hugo deserved what I dished out in fiction. Shortly after, another publishing company approached me with a lucrative 3-book deal. I didn't need the money, but out of loyalty, I gave my original publisher the first right to match the offer. They jumped at the chance, so I stayed with them. Over the next 18 months, I cranked out 3 more books. Each one had the same basic structure. Hugo got his, and Irene suffered for her sins. In the third, I even added some humor to mix it up a bit. All 3 books were successful, but more importantly, they helped me heal a little more with each one. The truth was, I knew I'd never get real answers to why Irene did what she did. The books were the only satisfaction I could get. Like the song says, love the one you're with, except in my case, that one was my fictional revenge. Then, I signed another 3-book deal. The money doubled again, but this time my publisher had bigger news. A movie studio wanted to adapt at least 2 of the books into feature films and were offering me a hefty payday. They even asked if I'd help with the screenplays. What the hell? I agreed. While I'd never been a huge fan of celebrity endorsements, I knew the power they held. So when a prominent figure selected my 6th book for their book club, my career shot into a whole new stratosphere. Suddenly, I was not only a successful author but also recognized in public. There were downsides, of course. Some people just wanted to knock me down a peg for no reason. That didn't bother me much. I wasn't impressed with myself either. Still, I didn't have to take crap from anyone. I could be rude right back if the situation called for it. One Friday evening, I was at my usual spot at the Ironwood pub, sipping Jack Daniels and relaxing. Despite my newfound wealth, now upwards of $10 million, I still enjoyed the simple things. A good drink, staying fit, and the occasional fling with a beautiful woman. I lived in the same rundown apartment and didn't care much about upgrading my lifestyle. The regulars at the bar mostly left me alone. They probably knew about my writing, but no one made a big deal of it. I figured half of them didn't even read, so that helped keep things low-key. Zane, my favorite bartender, knew about my success, and we chatted about it sometimes, but he was discreet. I made sure to slip him a $20 tip every time I came in, which probably contributed to his silence. I was lost in thought, half watching the TV when 2 women sat down next to me. Both were attractive, around my age, dressed casually in jeans and tops, definitely not trying to impress anyone. Still, there was something about them that drew me in. They were having a lively discussion, and after a while, one of them turned and said, "Isn't that the author guy?" I looked up, surprised to hear my name. "Yeah, that's me," I replied with a smile. They introduced themselves, Carrie and Layla, and before long, we struck up a conversation. I shared some stories about my life and how I'd gotten into writing, and they seemed genuinely interested. "Do you ever write about romance?" Carrie asked with a playful glint in her eyes. "Not exactly what I'm known for, but there's always room for more," I replied with a wink. Layla laughed and leaned closer. "You should try it sometime. You might be surprised how good you are." By the end of the evening, we were trading numbers, and I felt a sense of excitement I hadn't felt in ages. Maybe it was the alcohol, or maybe it was the thrill of new possibilities. Whatever it was, I welcomed it. We exchanged texts and agreed to meet again, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a glimmer of hope. I didn't have to define myself solely by my past anymore. I was on a new path, one filled with opportunity and adventure.